Oh. Hey, you ready? You ready? Good afternoon. The Readiness Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee will come to order. I welcome each of you to this hearing on the posture of the U.S. Navy. Today, the subcommittee will hear from the Chief of the Navy Reserve, the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Integration of Capabilities and Resources, and the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations, Plans and Strategy on how well the Navy is postured to meet the needs of this nation both today and in the future. Over the past 6 months, this subcommittee has held a series of hearings to examine shortfalls, gaps, and critical challenges facing the Navy's readiness recovery. In November, Vice Admiral Shoemaker described the ongoing challenges to naval aviation. In December, Vice Admiral Lewis described the shortfalls in amphibious warfare, and through a series of hearings and briefings, the Secretary of the Navy, Chief of Naval Operations, and Vice Chief of Naval Operations helped this subcommittee understand the underlying factors that led to the tragedies aboard the USS Fitzgerald and the USS John S. McCain. Today, the Readiness Subcommittee meets to hear how this year's President's budget intends to address remaining readiness gaps. This subcommittee will have a separate future opportunity to discuss the progress of the recommendation from the Navy's Strategic Readiness Review and Comprehensive Review recommendations. Across the surface, expeditionary, and aviation forces, the Navy continues to struggle to maintain the materiel readiness necessary to train and fight. Limited spare parts, backlog in depots, and insufficient manning both afloat and ashore impede the Navy's ability to train to meet the demands of a major conflict. We welcome the witnesses' perspective on these issues and any recommendations you may have. Before I introduce the witnesses, I'm grateful to turn to the distinguished ranking member of the Readiness Subcommittee, the gentlelady from the territory of Guam, Congresswoman Madeline Badallo, for her opening statements.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Last year was a very challenging year for the Navy, and I'm hopeful that 2018 will be much better in terms of improving your readiness posture. While we will have an opportunity at a future hearing to discuss the status of implementing the recommendations from the Navy's Strategic Readiness Review and Comprehensive Review, today the Readiness Subcommittee is meeting to hear details of the Navy's fiscal year 2019 budget request. So I look forward to hearing from you on the current readiness of the Navy's active and reserve components, the threat and operational challenges that you face, your plans for addressing these challenges, and what this subcommittee can do to support your efforts. At the conclusion of this hearing, I hope to better understand how the fiscal year 2019 budget request will improve the Navy's readiness, how you are prioritizing the modernization and the maintenance needs of the fleet. And as we begin to review the budget request, I'm concerned about whether this budget appropriately balances near-term readiness recovery through investments in the operation and maintenance accounts with long-term readiness through procurement and modernization. In terms of operation and maintenance spending, I note that the fiscal year 2019 request reflects only a 1.5% increase over the FY 2018 NDAA levels, while seeking a significantly larger increase in procurement accounts. Specifically, I note that the budget materials reflect the fact that the request would only resource 92% of the ship and aircraft depot maintenance requirements at funding levels below what was authorized in the FY 2018 NDAA. Gentlemen, we have heard about the readiness challenges the Navy is facing through various committee hearings and briefings. We have heard about the negative impact of continuing resolutions, as well as the shortfalls that exist in spare parts, reduced training hours, and critical personnel shortages. In light of the budget deal that was reached earlier this year, I am concerned that the fiscal year 2019 budget request fails to properly resource the accounts that help address these shortfalls and enable near-term readiness recovery. This committee wants to support your efforts to rebuild readiness and recovery from the budget uncertainty caused by sequestration and continuing resolutions. And we hope that today's hearing helps provide more details on the Navy's near-term and long-term readiness recovery plans as we begin our work on the fiscal year 2019 NDAA. So again, welcome, gentlemen, and I look forward to your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Congresswoman Badallo. I'm pleased to recognize our witnesses today. I want to thank them for taking the time to be with us. We have Vice Admiral Luke M. McCollum, Chief of Navy Reserve, Commander, Navy Reserve Force, and we're really grateful that your wife could join us today. Indeed, we all appreciate military families and the joint opportunities and sacrifices that military families have. So thank you for being with us today. We have Vice Admiral William Bill K. Lescher, the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations, Integration of Capabilities and Resources, and Vice Admiral Andrew L. Woody Lewis, the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Operations Plans and Strategy. Before we begin, I'd like to remind our witnesses that your full written statements will be submitted for the record. We'll ask that you summarize your comments in 5 minutes or less. And Vice Admiral Lescher, we will begin with you and look forward to your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Badallo, distinguished members of the Readiness Subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to join you today to talk about this critical issue of Navy readiness. As we start today, I do want to add our deepest condolences to the families and loved ones of the two outstanding naval aviators that we lost last week from the Black Lions of VFA 213. Their loss is a reminder of the tremendous sacrifices our men and women in uniform make in service to the nation. They and their families are in our thoughts and prayers as we do business today. Today, we look forward to discussing with you the critically important topic of Navy readiness, and I want to start by thanking the subcommittee for your leadership in enacting the 2017 request for additional appropriations, which addressed key readiness needs last year. We're also appreciative of the legislation approving 2018 and 2019 defense funding levels that, when enacted, will do so much to accelerate readiness recovery and strengthen our path to increased naval power. This 2019 budget request strongly aligns with the new National Defense Strategy, which highlights a return to great power competition and directs increased naval power in response. This budget also strongly aligns with the Secretary of Defense's three-phase budget campaign plan, which we've talked about in prior years' testimony as well. That plan, as you recall, prioritized improving warfighting readiness in 2017, addressing pressing shortfalls in the 2018 budget request while continuing to rebuild readiness, and growing capacity and improving lethality in 2019. As this subcommittee knows very well, our current readiness debt has accrued over a decade and a half of wartime operational tempo, Budget Control Act fiscal constraints, and 9 consecutive years of continuing resolutions. And we all understand it's going to take time, resources, and budget stability to recover that readiness. Today, our routinely deployed and next-to-deploy forces remain operationally ready to respond to any challenge, and we're working very hard to restore our ability to fully surge forces in a crisis. This work requires enactment of the FY18 budget now, 6 months into the fiscal year. Each additional delay in enacting this 18 budget postpones our readiness recovery. The 2019 budget will build on that enacted 2018 funding to improve the operational availability of today's ships and aircraft, and to modernize them with the advanced capabilities that are key to countering the threat. The 2019 budget funds our 4 major readiness accounts to 100% of the requirement or their maximum executable levels, which I'd be very happy to discuss in further testimony as we talk further today. That's the Ship Operations account, the Flying Hours account, and the Aviation and Ship Depot Maintenance accounts. This budget also increases funding for the readiness enabling accounts, such as aviation logistics, depot support, and spares. A key surge capacity enabler in this budget is the funding to increase maintenance throughput in our shipyards and our depots by continuing to hire and train new workers, recapitalize equipment, modernize information technology infrastructure, and better balance work between public and private shipyards. And while funding for our facility sustainment, restoration, and modernization account is still below that required to reduce the backlog, we were able to increase investment in FSRM this year and double the military construction budget from 2018 to fund key projects that increase lethality and restore warfighting readiness. Collectively, these investments are focused on driving readiness outputs, moving the readiness needle. The Navy is laser focused on executing this funding responsibly closely scrutinizing the spending while driving performance to plan. We're fully embracing the department-wide audit so that we can say with confidence to the American taxpayer that their hard-earned money is being spent as carefully as if it were their own. So I very much appreciate this subcommittee's role, the leadership role, in sustaining focus on this readiness recovery imperative, and we look forward to working together with the committee to build an increasingly ready and lethal Navy for our enemies, a supportive Navy for our allies, and a safe Navy for our sailors. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral Lescher. We now proceed to Vice Admiral Lewis.
Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Bordillo, and distinguished members of the Readiness Subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the operational aspects of Navy readiness. To start, I join with my colleague in thanking you for your efforts to pass an FY18 appropriation and the support you provided in the FY17 request for additional appropriations. These resources directly support the operational readiness of the fleet that you and the nation expect. The Navy generates readiness in order to deploy forces across the globe in support of the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. For the large majority of our forces, this means executing specified maintenance and training regimens in the United States prior to earning a certification to deploy at the Secretary of Defense's direction in support of the National Defense Strategy. When not deployed, Navy forces maintain a surge readiness to respond to contingencies. Taking place within a 36-month cycle, this force generation model provides predictability and stability for sailors and their families, the maintenance community, and industry, and also allows ships and squadrons to focus on building readiness without undue operational requirements. It also provides transparency to the joint staff and the combatant commanders on the number of forces the Navy can provide to the joint force on a sustainable basis. It has been very successful in meeting those objectives. A small segment of our forces, specifically the 4 deployed naval forces homeported in Japan, Spain, and Bahrain, have used a different force generation model. Intended to maximize the operational availability and crisis response capability of these 4 deployed forces, this model used a continuous certification concept which relied upon the periodic completion of unit-level training events to maintain proficiency and readiness across all mission areas. In the aftermath of the tragic USS Fitzgerald and USS John McCain collisions, however, it became clear that due to operational pressures, the Navy in the Western Pacific was sacrificing training opportunities for 4 deployed naval force ships in favor of meeting operational tasking. The excessive use of waivers and mitigation plans to maintain certifications, combined with the obvious operational inadequacies demonstrated by the collisions and other incidents, clearly showed that Japan-based ships were not meeting our readiness expectations. The Navy is taking decisive action to fix this, and as previously mentioned, both the Secretary of the Navy directed strategic readiness review and the Chief of Naval Operations directed comprehensive review of surface force readiness, made various recommendations to improve command and control and force generation practices for the 4 deployed naval force. We've begun to implement these recommendations. Specifically, we have eliminated all waivers and mitigation plans, conducted fleet-wide readiness assessments, established a command in Japan solely focused on readiness, and we are applying our standard force generation model to 4 deployed naval force ships. As you would expect, these actions have reduced the operational availability of our Japan-based ships in the short run as they undergo a rigorous recertification process. I expect that we will be past this initial bow wave by late spring this year. Full implementation of the new processes will take some time, but the end result will be a more ready, more capable, and more lethal Navy. Finally, please allow me to emphasize what you just heard from Admiral Lescher. Fully funding our readiness accounts is the foundation of operational readiness. Without properly manned, trained, equipped, and maintained forces, we will always be incurring a readiness debt that will be more expensive to pay off in the long run. In this current era of renewed great power competition, we cannot afford any degradations in readiness. On behalf of all of our sailors, civilians, and our families, I would like to thank the Congress and this committee for your support. I also look forward to working with you to ensure the operational readiness of the Navy we have now and in the future, the Navy the nation needs. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral Lewis. We now proceed to Vice Admiral McCollum.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Bodillo, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I would like to echo my thanks in your leadership in supporting readiness being restored to the Navy. It is my privilege to testify today in the readiness of the Navy Reserve. As part of the total force, the Navy Reserve has the responsibility to provide strategic depth and operational capability to our active component. Combatant commanders depend on the cost-effective and unique capabilities of the Navy Reserve and what it brings to the fight. Therefore, the Navy Reserve must be combat ready in order to deliver operational excellence in support of a more lethal and capable total force. Your Navy Reserve has been fully integrated and engaged over the past 16 years around the globe and serving as a total force multiplier. Since 9/11 alone, Navy reservists have mobilized over 81,000 times in support of the Navy and Joint Force. The ability to provide properly manned, trained, and equipped forces capable to sustain operations where and when needed requires predictability and funding. As we have mentioned in previous occasions, continuing resolutions and threats of shutdowns affect reserve component service members a little bit more uniquely than the active side. In particular, that they train on weekends. And as an example, Navy Reserve medical readiness in itself dropped 8% as a direct result of the canceled drill weekend in January when the government went into shutdown. Government shutdowns consume resources, they affect morale, and prevent us from focus on the warfighting lethality. Tomorrow would be a big beginning of a big travel day for a drill weekend this weekend, and there's already obviously some anxiety in the force. Consistent, stable funding is the most important step in our readiness recovery, and PB-19 focuses on sustaining that recovery. Navy Reserve force structure provides integration options across the globe, ranging from the mobilization of an entire unit to go to combat to an individual sailor in support of a single exercise. Our ability to surge and respond on short notice where and when needed is a critical piece that enhances the Navy's capability and lethality. To maintain this lethality, investment in aging reserve component equipment is critical to minimizing the interoperability gap between active and reserve components. Should this gap widen further, it will be challenging to provide the required support to the active component. Even though the challenges do exist in today's environment, I am proud of our sailors' dedication, their resilience, their morale, and their professionalism. The sacrifices made by sailors, employers, and families is immense in supporting the Navy our nation needs. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I sincerely appreciate the support you've given to date, and I look forward to taking your questions.
And thank you very much, Admiral McCollum. We'll now begin with the questioning by each of the subcommittee members, and we're very fortunate that Margaret Dean, who is a very dedicated Navy reservist herself, will be keeping the time. And so she's very punctual, we already know. So we'll begin. Admiral McCollum, sadly, we understand that most of the Navy Reserve's C-130 fleet remained grounded after the crash of the KC-130T in LaFleur County, Mississippi. Amongst the Navy's unfunded priorities list is a request for MP-2000 propeller kit. How would funding this propeller restore readiness of Navy Reserve aviation? What is the impact if this remains unfunded?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for that question. First of all, if we think about what the Navy Reserve brings to the logistics side of the Navy, Navy Reserve provides 100% of the inter-theater lift for the Navy. Said another way, boxes, people, crews, parts have to be sourced and delivered around the globe. The capability that resides in the Navy Reserve that delivers this is in the C-40 Alpha and the C-130 Tango. Those two aircraft provide that capability. Right now, we have 42% degradation in that capability, and that is related to the grounding of the C-130 Tangos. The recovery aspect of this, it allows us, in the form of this AS of the MP2000 propeller system, allows us to replace these propellers and restore readiness to these aircraft that would further allow us to continue our mission in supporting the fleet. So it's highly important that we upgrade our capability.
And additionally, what has been the impact on your maintenance crews and then pilot hours? And it just seems like it would be really catastrophic.
The demand signal for Navy Reserve in this capacity is very high. What we've been able to do is, while we're focused with these down aircraft, we've taken advantage of the flat hours and the crew because the mission continues. Our C-40s are operating 100% capacity, and we have vectored a lot of those mission sets to that location. With the proposal and the ask to replace with this propeller system, that it gives us the ability to get on pace and the timeline to restore on a steady, methodical way. And communicating that progress with our air crew gives positive support. And
the maintenance personnel, are they being utilized, or are they?
Absolutely. Okay. There's no shortage of need for aviation maintainers. And the one thing about the Navy Reserve is we are integrated with the active component. It does depend on which piece of the maintenance that resides, but we're an integrated force, and often you can walk into a squadron and see both active and reserve working together, and sometimes the demand signal is higher on one or the other, and we interchange provided that the skill set and certifications match.
Well, I'm grateful to hear that because the expertise of these individuals would be very difficult to replace. So best wishes. Admiral Lescher, this year's President's budget increases procurement by 10% over last year's National Defense Authorization Act levels, while sustainment showed just over a 1% increase. It is known that the sustainment of new systems is up to 70% of the lifetime cost. How is the budget request ensuring that readiness recovery remains on track while modernizing the force?
Yes, sir. Thank you for that question. The answer to that question is really embodied in this context of this 3-year campaign plan that the SecDef put out in January 17, and I alluded to that in the opening comment. So very much the highest priority, the initial priority of the Secretary of Defense was to restore readiness, and you saw that in the FY17 request for additional appropriations. In the 18 bill, which the Congress has right now, and we hope to see enacted by the 23rd of this week, there's growth above that level that really is in consonance with this concept of 18, further rebuilding the readiness. So in 17, for example, we executed, just in those 4 major readiness accounts that you highlighted and we talked about, $1 billion above the 16 level. In the 18 request, there's $3 billion in those 4 readiness accounts above that 17 level. And then to your point, the 19 level carries that forward. If you look even more broadly at wholeness or readiness to include personnel, equipment, supply, training, ordnance, networks, and installation, that growth from 17 to 18 is about $7.5 billion. And then from 18 to 19, it's about another just under $4 billion. So what has gone on is the department has very much emphasized readiness recovery in the 17 and the 18 bills. And now in 19, we're holding that level and driving that level while now starting to grow capacity and lethality. Part of what is also driving that choice of how to balance our portfolio is what this subcommittee understands, I know better than most, is it's not just resources, it's time. It takes time, particularly in our industrial operations, in our shipyards, in our fleet readiness centers, the aviation depots, to grow the labor force, now to execute that higher level of capacity. And so you're really seeing an analysis of the phasing, but to be very clear, as we talked about in the opening comment, The fact that we're 6 months into the FY18 year and still don't have that additional funding is part of what's constraining our ability to recover readiness and go forward. We're executing the first half of this year at FY17 funding levels. So all that goodness, all that accelerated readiness recovery that's in this FY18 bill hasn't started yet.
Well, thank you for addressing that. We now proceed to Congressman Badallo of the Territory of Guam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Vice Admiral Lescher, 2017 was challenging for the Navy, particularly with regard to the maintenance of the fleet. Several GAO reports discussed the extensive maintenance backlog for service ships and submarines. The Navy's own Strategic Readiness Review highlighted that the constrained ship repair industrial base capacity is inadequate to meet the current demand. Yet, when asked during a HASC hearing if the current depot-level ship repair capability was sufficient in the Pacific, the response contradicted the SRR findings. So I continue to be confused by the Navy's mixed message. With 60% of our naval fleet operating in the Pacific, is the ship repair capability sufficient or insufficient to meet the current demand?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. So your comments are exactly on point in terms of ship depot maintenance backlog and the need to assertively get after growing public shipyard nuclear maintenance capacity. As part of our response to that, Vice Admiral Tom Moore, the commander of Naval Sea Systems Command, authored a report that was conveyed to the committees about shipyard optimization. It talks about a 20-year effort to grow the public shipyard capacity to get after this backlog we're seeing in nuclear maintenance. More broadly, in terms of the Western Pacific, I know Secretary Gertz testified earlier about the Navy is committed to giving a fresh look at this analysis and is complying with the NDAA reports. First of all, to do a report on Western Pacific ship depot maintenance writ large, the requirements for capacity and capability, and then to also perform a business case analysis on courses of action to address and grow that. So it's work that is ongoing and that we will fully, obviously, share with the committee.
So,
Admiral, could you adjust everyone their microphone a bit better for the court reporter? Thank you very much. Excuse me, Mademoiselle.
that took 1 minute of my time, Mr. Chairman.
That was 5 seconds. I already measured it. Thank you.
Well, Admiral, then would you say you're on the way to improving capabilities? Is that what you're saying?
We are. So, for example, in the public shipyards,
Yes.
in the labor accounts, we're growing to 36,100 and
Okay.
capital investment, et cetera, yes.
I have a second question for any of you here. After years of concerns regarding readiness shortfalls and the impacts of sequestration, I'm concerned that the FY 2019 budget request may not appropriately balance long-term readiness recovery through modernization with near-term efforts through sustainment and maintenance. With regard to the FY19 budget, how will the request support near-term readiness recovery? And are there specific areas in the O&M accounts, such as ship or aviation depot maintenance, fleet air training, FSRM, or others, where you think additional resources could help with the readiness recovery efforts? Whichever one.
Yeah, ma'am, I'll take a stab at that. Thank you. I think the department remains very focused on near-term readiness recovery. At the same time, you also see, to the point you made in terms of procurement, in FY19 now starting to grow to a larger, more lethal Navy as well. But the investments in near-term readiness recovery that I highlighted earlier in our Big Four readiness accounts, that's essentially at maximum executable levels that are based on absolute physical capacity constraints to execute. Even in the enabling accounts, aviation logistics, aviation spares, depot support, they're at historic highs, all in the high 90s or 100%. So a very strong focus on accelerating readiness recovery, but it's going to take time. It's going to take time to, in these major industrial operations, the public shipyards, the aviation depots, as we're hiring engineers, we're hiring artisans. Now we have to train these new hires to get productive work out of them, and there's a big focus on that training program. We're making capital investment improvements as well. So I would say a strong focus from a portfolio balance perspective, heavy allocation of resources and near-term readiness. It's going to take time to move that needle, to move that output readiness metric.
Thank you, Admiral, and I yield back my remaining time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councilman. We appreciate your service very much. And we now proceed to Councilman Austin Scott of Georgia.
I apologize. 11 special capability ships. Admiral Lewis, this is pretty much for you, I believe. Although Transcom has operational control of the ships, the Navy owns the ships. These ships are required to meet the heavy and sustained logistical demands in any major conflict. And in peacetime, these ships, especially those like the Mercy and the Comfort, are essential to meeting humanitarian assistance and disaster relief efforts of both our nation, our allies, and even at times people that are our adversaries. If these ships are not funded, how will the Navy's warships be refueled? How will they be rearmed? How will they be resupplied with food? And how will we be able to support the casualties during a major conflict?
I'm actually going to yield this to Admiral Lescher. I think he's better suited to answer that question.
Yes, sir. Let me take a stab at that in terms of articulating how the department is addressing that urgent need that you highlighted. So 75 of these ships total, of these sea lift ships, 10 of them special capability, as you highlight. And the department has articulated a three-phase approach to address that, starting with service life extensions. So in this budget, this FY19 budget, there's funding across the 5-year program to do service life extensions on 21 of those ships. The second element of addressing that need is to, with the authorities we received from the Congress, which we're very much appreciative of, to buy used ships. So starting in FY20 and FY21, we'll buy one each year of a used ship. And then we're looking at recapitalizing those ships as well. So in FY19 and 20, there's R&D funding for a common hull replacement for those ships that will do the design work that will lead us to do a recapitalization of that fleet as well. So across service life extension, procuring used ships as a bridge, and then building new ships with the R&D we're doing on a common hull replacement. That's how the department's attacking that requirement.
So one of the things that I'm concerned about is, just as we talked about this week, we had a budget deal. Now we're having difficulty getting to the final language in an appropriations measure. We had, I think, hoped to be done by last week. We're still going this week. And so you've got a budget number for 18 and 19. The dispute right now in the appropriation measures is not over the funding of the military. But as you look out to 20, 21, 22, what do you see as far as the budget for the Navy? What are you making plans for?
So, sir, the Secretary of Defense has been provided some strong guidance on this. Secretary of the Navy as well has testified to the fact that clearly, as we grow to the larger, more lethal Navy, additional resources will be required, and we're going to look to develop those through reform. We're bringing a strong effort and across the board on not only executing new funds, but executing them in a more productive, a more effective, a more efficient way with strong accountability. In this PB19 budget, for example, in FY19, the Navy has $1 billion of reform from prior years that were generated and was actually allocated to buy readiness, to buy platforms. Across the 5-year program, Navy has about $4 billion of reform. So we're looking strongly at that. You know, the SecNav, DepSecDef both bring a very strong view on performance to plan that is helping us get after that. So work to be done. Clearly, I would also highlight in the context of what you say, Columbia recapitalization outside the fit-up is something that is going to require substantially higher levels of ship construction, Navy funding. So it's work for us to get after, to talk about with the department, but through a combination of reform and other relief to get after that.
I'm glad to hear that, and I think it would be wise for, and I've heard General Mattis say the same thing. Give us the 715 for 19, and we will the additions for 20, 21, and into the future. We'll find the reforms to help pay for that. And I think that that is wise advice to those of you in those positions. I think it is probably unlikely that you see additional increases in 19, 20, and 21. With that, I yield the remainder of my time.
Thank you very much, Congressman Scott. We now proceed to Congressman Joe Courtney of Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony here today. I'd like to follow up Ms. Bordallo's questions regarding the ship maintenance challenge, which is a big one for readiness, obviously. First of all, Admiral Lescher, I think there's unanimous support on the committee to, go back and really update and modernize our public shipyards. Clearly I think it's been like the 1900s, or it's since a lot of the work has been done there. But that's going to take some time. I think your own testimony was about 20 years process that's Admiral Moore is proposing. In the meantime, we've got a situation right now where between carriers and SSBNs, they kind of are just using up all the bandwidth at the public yards, and the attack subs have really been the poor cousins who Boise and the Albany are, the sort of poster childs for delays. But there's more than that in terms of the Connecticut took twice as long to do its repair availability as was originally planned. At the same time, we have combatant commanders who are testifying before our committee that they can't meet the even half the requirements that they have out there. So we just had a hearing with Assistant Secretary Gertz and Admiral Jabley, again, talking about some of the workforce issues as we sort of ramp up on Columbia and Virginia and the private yards, where there certainly are some industrial capacity for helping with the repair availabilities. Admiral McCoy, when he was the head of NAVSEA a number of years ago, always talked about sort of the one shipyard mentality, which is that he really didn't make a distinction necessarily between public and private yards. If the work was there, we want to keep metal tradesmen and welders and electricians, from sort of drifting off into other opportunities. So I guess, in terms of looking at the short-term challenge, particularly for the SSN fleet, what's your sort of take on the one shipyard mentality as a solution, which again is going to actually help us,
yes, sir.
Hit those production targets that we need to hit?
Yes, exactly. And I think you see that essentially we've embraced that, as you highlighted with the SSNs that are in private shipyards right now. So, as you know, we have 3 of them already in work between HII and Electric Boat, and a 4th, the Boise, scheduled to start in FY19. So and that's absolute good behavior and good practice for all the reasons you cited. I would say before we understood that well, you would see a behavior of us loading our public shipyards beyond their capacity. And so that's what led to, across the board, slowing down all the availabilities, loss of critical chain discipline. And so we recognize that, and really Boise, I would say, was a classic example of, in the execution year, the leadership said, hey, let's recognize if we simply don't have the capacity to execute that, and then let's essentially, with the concept you described, look to push that workload, that availability, that specific availability, to a private shipyard. So I think that's proper practice, but I also think that we want to fully load our public shipyards after making all those investments. I know Naval Reactors in particular is looking at the issue as we lead turn going into Columbia procurement to make sure the contractors are able to have the workforce trained and ready to execute that. So I think thoughtful analysis is being done on that. And then the broader question, I think the proof is really in our execution, where we are subscribing to that concept.
No, and I think you're right. Once that production really hits in around 2020, 2021, there's going to be a wall of production work that's going to make repair availabilities probably pretty hard to sort of squeeze in there. On the other hand, the public yards are going to have this new service life extension program, for the subs,
right,
with the upgrading the reactors. So, I think basically you're in a position, along with Admiral Moore, of trying to be the air traffic controller to kind of make sure that, this work sort of all sort of fits in, and the combatant commanders get with it.
That'll be capacity, analysis of capacity at all those locations, and just best practices, driving discipline into our process, but really an honesty as well in terms of where the capacity is, and then allocating the workload to that capacity.
Great. And one last question for Admiral McCollum. Again, Mr. Wilson asked about the Navy C-130s, and again, the new propellers. You mentioned again that was not in the 19 budget. Assuming we were able, through our subcommittee and the appropriators, find the resources, I mean, would that accelerate the process of getting these planes back up in the air?
Well, certainly, because it would instill confidence in our strategy, in our planning assumptions. Absolutely. Right now, we're estimating 12 to 18 months, and the fleet needs it sooner.
Great. And so the propellers, though, I mean, as a process, would be able to be installed quicker than the sanding down and the refurbishment of the old ones. Is that
we would make progress on that timeline. It does. It is a precision exercise to do that, as you just articulated. Yeah. But it would definitely help.
Great. Thank you. Just wanted to get that on the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for a few extra seconds.
Here, here. And thank you, Congressman Courtney. We now proceed to Congressman Ro Khanna of California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your service to our country. I just have one question. You mentioned that you would like to bring up the Navy's structural force from 308 ships to 355 ships from 2014 to 2016. And I was curious what the reasons for the additional ships are, what they will be used for, and how they serve our national interest.
Yes, sir. Thank you. I'll take a stab at that. The foundational analysis for the 355 ships was a force structure assessment that the department did in 2016. So the force structure assessment looked at the combatant commander command to execute the strategy, and then based on that, integrated what that would require. I don't recall what the initial number was. It was substantially north of 355. And then the department accepted risk to that execution, said we're going to allocate risk in certain theaters at less than the requirement and come to a fiscally informed moderate risk force of 355. Beyond that force structure assessment, the Congress directed the department to execute future fleet architecture studies. So MITRE Corporation, Center for Strategy, but CSBA, Center for Strategic Budgetary Analysis, and an internal Navy team each did an independent look, also in the context looking forward of the security environment going forward. And each of those approaches also showed the need for a substantially larger Navy, each with a different number, but substantially larger than 308. So that is the context, strategically informed, execute the strategy, execute the combatant commander's requirements to set their theater and execute their O plans is what drove that number.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. We now are concluding person participating, somebody we know and love, Congresswoman Elise Stefanik of New York.
Thank you, Chairman Wilson. A traditional strength of the reserve force has been the ability to leverage civilian skills which strengthen subject matter expertise across the naval enterprise. And in May 2016, during a joint hearing with the Committee on Sea Power and Projection Forces and this subcommittee on readiness, the commanding officer of Naval Construction Group 2 testified that only 30% of today's reserve force enters with equivalent civilian experience compared to historically over 70%. How are you addressing these gaps in training and subject matter expertise in our reserve sailors?
Congresswoman, thank you for that question. I will tell you, not a day goes by that I don't get a request of a unique civilian skill set to serve our Navy. For the full spectrum, the skill sets you just outlined, as well as things like additive manufacturing, data science, artificial intelligence. This is why I'm so proud to lead the reserve force with their unique civilian skills that they do. I'm in a close partnership with the Chief of Navy personnel, and we continually talk about permeability, meaning, said another way, the ability for somebody in the reserve force to surge and be part of the active force, somebody on the active force to be on the reserve force. And we continue to work with the authorities that Congress has given us to support this. Additional authorities and discussions related to this with DOTMA and ROTMA reform and so forth allow us to toggle, so to speak, between the two environments of what is mandated legislatively for active and reserve in strength. With regard to the focus, the laser focus on civilian skill set, we are launching this spring a requirement of our Navy Reserve sailors to be more detailed in how they enter in a data reserve skill set database. We've given them the means and the communications we're just rolling out. This will at least allow us to have a repository of the reservists in their current skill sets. When we look to accessions, we've now been looking at the two ways we assess. One is direct accessions with no prior service, and accessions with prior service. In the CB area, the Construction Battalion Force, we recognize that there are construction mechanics, there are individuals on the street doing this type of work that we need in our Navy Reserve, and we're in active discussions on how we lever those strengths and cross-rate those civilian qualifications, how they might merit the qualification that the Navy has. So we're very open, and we just got to get our certifications right and how we recognize that, but we are all in on civilian skills.
Thank you for that. My last question relates to testimony a year ago in March of 2017, where it was stated, quote, to characterize where we are today, we would say it's the tale of two navies. The Navy's deployed units are operationally ready to respond to any challenge. Unfortunately, the status of units and installations back home in the United States paint a different picture. The strain is significant and growing. Do you still feel today, a year later, that it is the tale of two navies? And have you seen any positive change when it comes to the strain placed on the units and installations back at home?
Ma'am, I would say it still is a tale of two navies. Absolutely. And the reason is because we haven't received the additional funding that was requested in that FY18 bill. So as I alluded to earlier, we're still executing at that FY17 level of funding. Now, there has been absolutely goodness that's occurred, and progress is being made. And again, the FY17 request for additional appropriations was key to enabling ships to sail, pilots to fly, and critical shore infrastructure maintenance to take place. But to get traction, to accelerate readiness, to really start driving these output needles, we need the FY18 bill enacted, and then this FY19 bill will build on that, build on that progress we make. This concept earlier about is a combination of resources and time that will really enable us, particularly in our industrial operations, the public shipyards, the fleet readiness centers, to drive that improvement, to hire the additional labor, to make the capital investment, to drive the throughput increase that will really get us traction, as well as the increased funding for facility sustainment, restoration, and modernization in this 18 bill. There's a lot of goodness in the bill. When enacted, we are absolutely positioned right now to move forward when that bill is enacted.
Thank you for that. I yield back.
And thank you, Congresswoman Stefanik. As we conclude, I want to thank Commander Margaret Dean for her service, Tom Hawley. We've got professional staff that are doing such great service, and we also will be providing questions for the record on readiness accounts. If there's no further business, we are adjourned.